I'd like to skip an introductory speech that I prepared and hand you straight over to Jock to talk about mutualism, which is Kevin Carson's ideas, I guess.
Right, thank you, David. Being the only thing that stands between you and coffee, I'll probably be able to make up some considerable time, I suspect. I do feel actually a little bit of a fraud standing up here. You've had, had a day of erudite and polished speakers, and now you've got me. And you've had a day of speakers with whom most libertarians in the room can probably sit there and nod quite happily. And mine might be the speaking equivalent of lobbing a grenade into the room and running, since I'm talking about one bit of libertarianism that lots of people probably will disagree with. So that's a good start. I'm also billed as a Liberal Democrat, but I'm not quite sure how good how good my standing is within the party. I should probably rather have been doing a bit of hewn worshipping at our South Central conference yesterday, rather than coming here and listening to a Conservative MP in the National Liberal Club. And I'm down as a blogger, which, everyone in here is a blogger, and I haven't written for a month. And the last time I did write, I lost one of my jobs as a result. So, I'm also, the title of what I've got to say is on mutualism, which gives the impression that I may be some kind of an expert on this thing called mutualism. I'm not. It is part of the political journey that I've made, or that I'm continuing to make. And it doesn't imply either that I agree with every last bit of it. I'm not, as somebody put it last night, a Carsonite. I'm not simply an acolyte of this ism that I'm going to try and explain. Part of that political journey has taken me in 10 years or so from being a naive single young man, thinking in having moved down to Oxford and made that my home, thinking that it would be a great thing I could help my community by getting involved in local politics. And 6 weeks later I was a city councillor. I was firmly of the tendency that said, oh, if only we can do this or that more efficiently, we'll be able to help people a lot more. Fortunately, 3 years later, the good people of Oxford decided they didn't want me for another term, and that bubble was burst. And in the interim, I had my main interests on the council, for example, were planning and housing. And I began to take an interest in mutual solutions to affordable housing problems, which obviously, as anybody in the southeast knows, are quite serious, and Oxford is just as bad as any. So as part of that, I became a Georgist politically. And I remember 2 years ago, which was the first time I had come to one of these, sitting in the front row and talking to the chap next to me and asking what he was, and he said, I'm an Austrian. I didn't understand what on earth that meant. I said, I'm a geo-libertarian, and he looked at me and he said, oh. Now, in the course of, for those who don't know, Georgists, Henry George was a 19th century American political economist. Well, actually, he was a journalist and merchant seaman who recognized that land and land values in particular were one of the main causes of poverty. He went on a 15-month trip from San Francisco to New Zealand and back or something, and noticed that whilst there had been a vast increase in overall wealth, there were still a lot of people on the breadline without a roof over their head and so on. And he put 2 and 2 together and made what then I thought was 4, but is probably now somewhere closer to 7 or something like that. Got it wrong. But in the process of discovering about Henry George, I got into this sort of group of 19th century American individualist anarchists and the Mutualists, who had a correspondence with Henry George, just as Herbert Spencer did, for example, arguing against his case that that was the primary cause of poverty, I mean, amongst plenty. So I started to get interested in this notion of mutualism. And I should say, I suppose, now that I'm getting to the definition stage, what it's not. We're not talking here simply about the movements such as the International Cooperative Alliance and the cooperative movements as a whole. That's a subset of what I'm talking about as mutualism, which is a school of anarchist thought that developed primarily from the likes of Proudhon in France, which translated through unlikely people like Robert Owen into North America, where he came across people like Josiah Warren in his New Harmony intentional community, and then through the later individual anarchists, and sort of coming to an end with Benjamin Tucker towards the end of the 19th century, who had this, which was his magazine, The Freeman, was it, I think? Liberty. Now, their central insight was they took their economic inspiration from Smith and Ricardo and run parallel with Marx. They adhere, for example, to a labour theory of value, for example. Now, I thought I understood that when I read the sort of modern, contemporary, we've already mentioned Carson, but one of his books on mutualist political economy. I'm not an economist, and that's the first time that somebody had tried to explain to me about value theories, and I thought I understood it at that time, but I've subsequently watched lots of Mises stuff and understand that even labour costs are subjective. So, I'm beginning to doubt that. But the end game doesn't alter for that, I don't think, personally. Their central insight was that whereas in the Marxian critique of the state, they would want to, if you like, monopolize everything in the proletariat, the individualist anarchists saw that it was the state itself that enabled, and not just enabled, but assisted in the exploitation of labour by granting great privilege to capital and to landowners and so on. And they identified what they called the four great monopolies, which, as I say, first of all, the banking and money monopoly. So we hark back to Stephen's talk yesterday. They identified that as the most important factor in resulting in that 80% that owned nothing that we talked about yesterday being unable to reach their potential and to develop themselves. Cheap access to capital. At a time when they were obviously at a time when metallic money was common, metallic-backed money was common. People like William Batchelor Greene in Massachusetts felt that could be monopolized, and along with Proudhon, monopolized and then charged the earth force, so keeping the small man out of access to capital. And so they posited an idea of mutual banking, which I'm not sure quite where that fits in with the Cobden Centre and so on. I guess it's one of those ideas that in a free market in banking would either succeed or fail. It tends to be something that might be out of its time, in that it was intended for small trading communities, when we had a bank per town sort of thing. But the basis is that all the participants in this currency network, mutual banking network, would pledge property that they owned or something like that, and then issue notes to each other as credit for trading. So the new entry into someone starting up in business could have access to very cheap capital. In fact, the idea was that being a mutual, it wouldn't take any profit at all, and it would only have to charge the cost of administration for loans and so on. Their second big area was land, and this, as I said, this was an area that was particularly interesting to me. Proudhon's contention is that rent is one of those other aspects of usury that keeps the poor man poor. And for the mutualists and the individual anarchists, contrasted with George wanted to tax the rental value of land, which of course by the time you become an anarchist means that you have to have a state, and so it kind of falls over for me. But the mutualist idea of land ownership is occupancy and use, rather than, if you like, the Rothbardian non-proviso Lockean first appropriation. Now that's where probably the grenade comes into the room, because we all like to think of ourselves as keen on private property. I actually don't. I'm beginning to sort of have an idea that the two aren't so very far apart. If you own something that you don't use, whilst Rothbard and co. might have difficulty, or might say you don't automatically abandon it, and therefore, if you stop using it, and therefore enable someone else to homestead it, actually what you've still got to do is protect it. Your own, absent the state granting property title, somehow you're going to need to insure and protect your title. And if you're not there, standing with the shotgun at the gate, you're going to have to pay someone else to do that, more than likely. And those insurance payments and protection, security payments and so on, I suspect those would rise roughly well, they have to rise to counter the number of potential claims there are against that particular piece of property. So you're probably taxing away the rent in the form of insurance payments. And of course, if you have a mutual insurance company with profits, then you're also likely to be able to hand out that rent payment in the form of dividends to your members. Now, there are two other big monopolies which need probably less discussion, were tariffs, meaning all sorts of taxes, as well as particularly protectionist ones. And whilst they were keen on abolishing all of those, it's probably important to notice that they suggested that there had to be an order to it, that you couldn't, for example, remove protectionist tariffs until you had done things with the money system, so that when you allowed cheap foreign goods in, the workers that were already being screwed by the system here weren't kept out of access to capital, so they had an alternative to go to actually set up on their own in business and so on. So the hierarchy of these monopolies was that we had to do something first about the money monopoly. Now, where it's been dormant for the best part of a century, really. This American chap, Kevin Carson, picked up probably 15 years ago or so, and tried to resurrect this as a narrative which resonated with the left. As we again mentioned yesterday, that 80% has a natural tendency towards socialism. And of course, at the moment, the one form of socialism that they know of is the state version. And Tucker, in his wrote an essay to introduce a book that he wrote called State Socialism and Anarchism, basically setting out that both Marxism and anarchism were two sides of socialism. That, as I say, Marxism was all about turning monopolies into monopoly. And whilst they both sought to give labour its full product, the one did it coercively and the other voluntarily. And so Carson has picked this up in the last 15 or 20 years and tried to resurrect it. It fell into disfavour, I suppose, at the turn of the 20th century, when there was a split, really, within that sort of anarchist movement. Some felt that removing the state was no longer just enough. That, for example, the big industrial trusts in America had become so large that even if you removed the state, they could behave like a state. And so, we had the movement into the sort of anarcho-syndicalists and the workers' movement trying to violently take over firms and so on. And then on the other side, we start with the progressive movement, the emergence of the sort of Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism as a reaction to the growing state after the progressive movement and the New Deal and so on. So it had fallen into disuse. But as I say, this sort of resurrection of it seems quite timely, because we're coming to the point where state socialism is, for a lot of people who are vaguely aware, is apparently failing. People are actually seeing that it's failing, but they're not ready, like I wasn't 10 years ago, to make that leap into sort of small state. Or, as I was told by friends and so on 5 years ago when I said, I think I'm a libertarian, and said, you mean those right-wing nutters that read Ayn Rand? And there are lots of people who aren't ready to take that leap. I certainly haven't read her. And mutualism provides that narrative, and for the wider movement enables us to tell a story to that what has now been seen as left wing, to grab them in, that it is the state that causes the excesses of capitalism that they feel that they feel are neoliberal economics and so on. And for example, within the Liberal Democrats, I've been trying to develop an idea that policy-wise, rather than looking at what interventions they can do, because it's a knee-jerk interventionist party just as much as anything else, that we should be looking at eradicating those elements of state privilege granting that cause the problems in the first place, that they then think, we need to put some more welfare in place to solve this. So, for example, the two that I've been concentrating on recently, one quite timely is housing benefit, partly because of my interest in land and developing affordable housing and so on. But housing benefit isn't a subsidy to poor people, it's a subsidy to landowners. And in providing that subsidy, it's a safety net, okay? It's a safety net because they won't dip their rents below what they can get out of us. And as a result, every last one of us who rents privately, even without housing benefit, have their rents buoyed up by the amount that housing benefit starts at. And not only that, but every last one of us who wants to buy a house, because housing capital costs are based largely on the rental yield for another group of buyers, our capital costs in housing, and thereby our debt and our so on and so forth, in a vicious cycle, are all increased just by this 120 billion redistribution of our money to people who have got more than one house. Yeah? And my second main example is healthcare, particularly in the context of the US debates last year in healthcare. the UK system has worked roughly the same as this. It's, you know, it's unremarkable. In America, 80 years ago or so, provision of healthcare was through mutual and friendly societies that Chris mentioned yesterday, and so on and so forth. In many cases, they clubbed together and built their own medical schools and so on. In many cases, those medical schools were educating people who the middle class medical schools wouldn't, black community and women and so on and so forth. And the friendly societies would hire on an annual retainer doctors from these medical schools, so they got them cheap. But of course, who didn't like that? But the middle class doctors who liked to charge by the hour. So they clubbed together, the American Medical Association and so on, and lobbied the then government for special privileges. They banned black community medical schools, and so the costs of doctors, the costs of virtually everything to do with healthcare were vastly increased. And it's just as 60-something years ago, when Bevan was implementing Beveridge's plan, he was supposedly asked, how did you get the doctors to agree to this? And he said, it was simple. I stuffed their mouths with gold. So that state protection, if we can eradicate the sort of, the protectionist policies that have created all of that over the years, we can reduce the costs of living and of essential services and so on, and bring up the standard of living for the poorest in society. So using that kind of narrative, I think, that we can hook in members of the left who maybe left, after a decade and a half of New Labour and so on, not having a home to go to. At the moment they're, has our next speaker arrived yet? At the moment they're often scurrying off in the direction of the Greens, but I think, we'd probably rather have them with us. So I think probably, as I say, I was going to try and cut time short, so I quite like doing this in discussion anyway, so I'll leave more till then. Okay, thank you very much. 7 minutes.